Long stages, slippery movement, bottomless pits, and a complex control scheme. Those are the things that make Sonic Heroes a difficult game. I didn't want to spend an entire video tiptoeing around that with my clickbait title and all, so I thought I'd just be upfront about it. Welcome to my Sonic Heroes retrospective. When Sega went third party, there was a lot of pressure on Sonic Team to get things going with a banger, to show that they'd remain relevant in the gaming community. It was crucial that the next game in the series appealed both to hardcore Sonic fans as well as the gaming community as a whole, because this would be a fresh start for the Blue Hedgehog, so they couldn't simply title a game Sonic Adventure 3 and expect gamers that didn't have a GameCube or Dreamcast to quickly flock over to buy the game. Especially if those gamers determined they'd have to play the first two adventure games but didn't own the consoles they were available on. And in addition to that, since Sonic Team was so desperate to appeal to the masses, they seemingly decided to throw out every single thing about the adventure games that was criticized. It was crucial that they'd get this right. And honestly, if you look at the sales and reviews, it was probably the right choice. But I'd argue that they sacrificed too much of what was appealing to the hardcore Sonic fanbase in order to appeal to the casuals. I think the discourse of the game over time sort of proves that. When Sonic Heroes released, there were three main types of Sonic fans. Those that grew up with the classics and jumped to 3D and played the adventure games, and those that strictly started with the 3D games, or maybe the advanced games, and those that grew up with the 2D games but never made the jump with Sonic to 3D because they got an Xbox or PlayStation. That third category was by far the largest, because most people went from the 16-bit era to the PlayStation 2. And I'd argue that the third category was also the most casual of the fanbase at the time because Sonic is what they played as a kid. They didn't grow into a teenager or high schooler with the series. They moved on and left it in the past. The more hardcore Sonic fans stuck with the series because they wanted to go wherever Sonic went, so they bought the consoles and games that he was on. Which means that the first two categories make up the brunt of the more hardcore fans. The players that grew up with the adventure games, those young Sonic fans that statistically were introduced to the series with Adventure 2 Battle, many of them found issues with Heroes in that they were expecting a deeper story they could connect after Shadow's death in SA2, and the high stakes in general in that game. Many were also accustomed to the different playstyles and stage types too, not realizing only until much later that there was something scoffed at by the gaming community. In that regard, Heroes was considered very watered down. It was just a single type of stage and forgettable nothing story. Shadow was there, but at least at face value, it seemed like it was still a non-story. Additionally, Sonic's control was much tighter in the adventure games, so while they could adapt to Heroes' controls, it still felt like a downgrade. I think many of these younger fans did eventually grow to love Heroes, but I don't think it had nearly as much of an impact on them as Adventure 2 did. The other fans, the ones that grew up with the 2Ds and jumped to 3D with Sonic, well, they're kind of hit or miss. If they shifted over and loved the 3D games, then a lot of their feelings about Heroes would be similar to those younger fans that started with Adventure 2 Battle. But the difference is because they were older and cooler kids now, they just decided to hate on Heroes. Because that was the cool thing to do. Since there was already a precedent set by the other half of the people that grew up and made the transition to 3D who had been hating on adventure games as well. Basically, if Adventure 1 or 2 didn't turn a classic fan against Sonic, Heroes definitely did. And unfortunately for Heroes, over the next 3 years with the release of Shadow in 06, it would be sucked into those games and be considered one of the Dark Age Sonic games. Because while the older hardcore Sonic fanbase was split on the adventure titles, they were pretty unanimous on their distaste for Heroes. And they were setting the narrative. Unfortunately for them though, Heroes had a huge pull, and was not nearly as controversial as a game as say Shadow was for its edginess or as broken of a game as 06 was. Over time many people would defend it. It's actually pretty clear to see why Heroes was able to separate itself from the hate. Well, at least it's clear to me. Despite the popular belief, Sonic Adventure 2 Battle is not the game that we should all assume was the introduction to a whole generation of Sonic fans. The numbers indicate that it was more likely to be Sonic Heroes. At their releases, Heroes outsold SA2 Battle by almost twice as much. Even if you were generous and assumed that every single GameCube owner that bought Heroes started with SA2 Battle first, then Heroes would still have introduced a good 30 or 40% more new people to the series than Adventure 2 did. If you look at it from that regard, then it's very clear why Heroes was able to shake the Dark Age classification seemingly very easy. There is statistically more likely a chance that current Sonic fans, the younger millennials and older Gen Zers, started with Heroes before they played SA2. And beyond that, a majority of them started their Sonic jersey with Heroes on PlayStation 2 specifically. The PS2 version of Heroes was by far the worst version of the game too. And despite that, so many Hero fans came to the rescue because in essence, it's a good game. And in later years, as more and more people would get introduced to the series with the Boost era titles and decide to revisit the older 3D games on Dolphin, many of them would praise Heroes more than every other Sonic game in the pre-Boost era because Sonic Heroes could basically fit into the meta era. It has linear level paths and a simple story and only one gameplay style. Usually the only gripe people have is the team mechanic, which is what causes more people to praise the speed stages in SA1 and 2 above Heroes, but I'd argue that Heroes as a whole is praised and fits in more with today's fandom than SA1 and 2 do as a whole. Of course, this is just my opinion, based off my casual lurking of the fandom throughout the past 2 decades. I could be wrong. I probably am. But honestly, the Sonic community is so diverse that even if I'm wrong about it all as a whole, I probably checked off a good 15 to 20% of the fanbase. As far as my experience with Heroes goes, I mentioned this in some of my previous videos, but we didn't buy Heroes. I'm really not sure why. If I had to guess, it's probably because we only used to buy 1 or 2 games a year. I say we, but it was my parents buying them for us after we'd beg for weeks or months. And during the early 2000s, my brother and I would always buy the newest NHL game and just play that over and over again. That continued until around 2004 or 5 when we got an Xbox and just played Halo and Super Monkey Ball Deluxe. So Heroes, Shadow, and 06, 3 games that released in 04, 05, and 06, got left behind due to timing, and I wouldn't go back to Sonic until I got my Wii in 06 and bought Secret Ring shortly after that. The first time I played Heroes was in 2017 or 18, sitting in a work truck during some downtime on a construction site, emulating it on Dolphin on my Galaxy Note 8 with touch controls. And if you thought controlling Heroes was slippery with a controller, then oh my god, don't ever torture yourself the way I did. Don't get me wrong, I was actually able to get through the whole game, I think. Well, the Sonic story anyway. Looking back now, I have no idea how I did it. Funnily enough, the hardest part was just switching around the characters. Using a single button for jump and a touchscreen joystick wasn't nearly that hard. But still, I'd never recommend that experience to anyone. When I played the game for this playthrough, it felt a million times better. And of course it did. I was using an actual controller. And going through the first stage, I was shocked at how much hate the game actually had received. But then I realized it's because I'm not only comparing the game to my touchscreen experience, I'm also comparing it to Shadow that I played before this. And this controls much better than Shadow for the most part. I say for the most part because there are certain things they tightened up about Shadow's controls that they hadn't yet. Like his homing attack and rail grinding and whatnot, I feel like is better than in Heroes. But the heaviness in Shadow is not apparent here. This is actually a big problem when you look at these games in hindsight versus how they felt at the time. To this day, the adventure games are considered the best Sonic and Shadow have felt to control in an open 3D space, which means every time you bought a game, it got worse to control. But I still argue that the different feel to the controls is not all that different once you play for a bit and adapt. The problem is, not all games are as forgiving and allow you to adapt. I didn't really discuss this in my 06 and Shadow videos, but when you take damage in 06, your ring count goes to 0. When you take damage in Shadow, you don't, which means in 06, you feel the jank in your controls much more than you would feel it in Shadow, because 06's jank could lead significantly to more deaths. And in 06, the stages are much longer too, and a game over will send you to the beginning of the level or even before that if you hadn't saved it yet. So the punishment for the ring damage ends up being drastically more than simply losing all of your rings. It could mean repeating an hour of gameplay at times. There is a similar issue when you compare Shadow and Heroes. Both games control fairly similarly, I would say, but the stages in Shadows are much shorter than the ones in Heroes, and Shadow's game contains significantly fewer areas of platforming over bottomless pits. So while you could mess up a homing attack or screw up a jump from a higher location in Shadow, you're less likely to lose a life for it. And if you do lose a life for it, unless it's like the last life and you just killed 49 out of 50 gun soldiers or something, you hardly feel like it's that frustrating of a punishment. This is effectively why I refer to Heroes as a hard game. Controlling the 3 different characters in essence isn't all that bad. And I promise you in a few minutes I'm actually going to get into the mechanics of this game rather than just talking about the perspectives. But the control of the characters isn't the issue. It's the fact that fumbling around and figuring out the right character to use, especially on your first playthrough, is more often than not likely to lead to your death, which is likely to make you repeat a large portion of the stage back to the checkpoint, or potentially the whole stage, because the stages are very long. Something as simple as learning how to time the flying character's flight could mean you died at the 12th minute mark of a 14-minute level and had to repeat all of that. And oh yeah, when you get back to that jump again, you still might die because it's been 12 minutes since you last tried it and you can't remember exactly how you timed it last time. And the same thing could apply to getting the right homing attack or triangle jump in, or using the correct combat maneuvers. Does all that make sense? Because I wholeheartedly believe the biggest gripe most people have with this game is not the fact that you have to beat 4 playthroughs, but it's because in essence, going through those playthroughs can be an unforgiving and frustrating mess. And with that, I think I'm actually ready to discuss the game itself.
Alright, let's go!
The way the game is laid out is you control 3 different players at the same time. For Sonic Team, it's Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles. Sonic is the speed character, Tails is the flight character, and Knuckles is the combat character. There are minor differences in the way they attack, but Team Dark, Team Rose, and Team Chaotix basically have the same exact control schemes as Team Sonic. Basically, the speed character is the fastest, has a homing attack, can triangle jump, ring dash, and perform an air tornado. There's also a rocket acceleration. I don't think I used more than once or twice. The flying character is the slowest and best for platforming, or making it to hard to reach areas. They also are needed to destroy or at least stun enemies that are higher up to make them fall to the ground and allow the power character to finish them off. The power character is sort of the best of both worlds. They have medium speed, can combat most robots without any assistance. I say most because some enemies will require the speed or flying characters to lower the robot's defenses before Knuckles can defeat them. And the power character can also glide across many platforms, albeit to a less effective degree than the flying characters. As you play through each stage, you can level up each character 3 times by collecting the corresponding orbs for that specific formation. Through most of the game, this powering up will happen naturally, but the more you play, the more you'll realize the player you're controlling will automatically level up when you cross a checkpoint. And also when you defeat enemies, they might randomly drop orbs, with the colors they drop corresponding to the 2 formations you're not using. So in that regard, you can use some tactic to level up a specific character if you should please. But I'll be straightforward. Until the final boss of each playthrough, I never put any thoughts into powering anybody up, and it just kinda happened naturally as I played. Which I think is best, because there's already way too much to think about as you play through these stages, since it's not just a typical start to end speed stage, and is the first game in the series that included health bars and just flat out areas where you have to combat to advance. Which obviously, since I'm running through these games in reverse, isn't all that new, but it was new when the game came out, and caused a lot of controversy. Without going into too much detail as to why, I'll take this moment to rank the games with combat during the regular gameplay, specifically on how much I enjoyed the combat. It goes Unleashed, Frontiers, Shadow, Heroes, 06, and then boom. And I don't know if it counts or not, but if it does, Black Knight would be last in that regard. Also, I've heard many people make the argument that the power character is their preferred control because they have the most balanced stats. But rest assured, if you're someone that just loves flying through the game with a speed character and you develop confidence in your timing of your homing attacks, like me, you'll enjoy the heck out of the speed characters. I always defaulted back to the speed character unless I felt like I absolutely couldn't finish an area without them because of an extra sensitive platforming section or something of that nature. And even then, there are certain sections of the games where the stage will automatically swap you with the character you should be controlling, or other moments where the stage will have indicators of who you should swap to, or even portions where one of the characters will flat out hint at who you should be controlling. Another quick note since I always hear this come up, I enjoyed the characters chatting it up during gameplay. That shouldn't really be a surprise to anyone that's watched my videos. Many people find it annoying when their characters aren't mute, but I like to chatter, even if it can get repetitive. Finally, the last point about the movesets that I think is worth mentioning is that you have a bar in the top right corner that fills up as you run through the game and defeat robots. When it fills up, you can use the Team Blast, which effectively defeats every enemy within your vicinity. One of the best tactics in this game is figuring out which enemies are the best ones to use the Team Blast against, especially when you face off against the gauntlet-style boss battles against waves of enemies. Sometimes it's worth using it immediately because it'll refill, and other times you'll hold on to it because you know there'll be one section that will be super difficult because you lost a life in that area. It's a good tool, and also good to have in your back pocket to use if you think you're losing control and about to be defeated. My only gripe is that the animation does take a bit long, but it's only a minor complaint. An actual critique I think worth making about this game, or really it's more of a suggestion on how it could have been better, is that I think the game would have been better off without swapping around team members. I understand they wanted to give the player the control, but I think it would have been better off if you just automatically stayed in the speed formation, and they used the 2 swap buttons for flying or combat. Or if the game took control out of the player's hands and just had different sections where you were required to control only one of the characters, like how it does in Sonic 06, where you'd randomly switch to one of the friend characters for a specific section of the level. I understand why they didn't do that, because if they did, everyone would probably complain that they're being forced to play as a different character or something. But if, for example, they limited the moments you absolutely have to switch to Knuckles or Tails in the combat and flying sections, then designed the stages around Sonic with the occasional press of a button for flight and combat through 80% of the stage, with maybe 10% each being reserved to swapping complete control to Tails and Knuckles, I think you'd have a good balance and a diverse moveset and make it much less complicated for players to have to think on the fly of which character is best to use during a high-speed platformer. Part of the reason the stages are much longer in this game is because they decided to not split the stages up. So rather than run through a stage that involves flying or a stage that involves combat, they threw areas that will require you to use your flying character to platform or your power character to defeat an enemy. Through most of the game, there are sections that are meant for one character specifically, but they could also be done by a different character. For example, Sonic could use a homing attack over and over again and defeat an enemy, but it's much easier to just use Knuckles and move on quicker. Part of the fun of this game is to figure out which character to use is the best to optimize your playthrough. As you get better, you might skip a Tails section entirely by timing a Sonic homing attack, for example, Or you might use Tails' attack to finish off an enemy faster than Knuckles because you know which attack works on which type of robots better. It's not really taught as part of the game, but part of the enjoyment in Sonic games is always about trying to figure out how to move through the game faster and faster. And in that regard, the way the game is set up makes a lot of sense, since you do have to run through each stage 4 times between all of the playthroughs. The issue is the game doesn't tell you which order to play those playthroughs in and leaves it up to you, and I think this is one instance where putting the power in the player's hand is a mistake. Team Sonic is considered the normal playthrough, Team Dark is the hard playthrough, and Team Rose is the easy playthrough. I didn't include Team Chaotix in that because they're the mission playthrough. Think the mission system in Shadow the Hedgehog. The issue is that many people have a gripe in that you're required to play through all 4 stories in order to unlock the final boss. Can I just say that right off the bat, I don't think it's worth going through the story 4 times to get to the final boss. There's no big story and payoff, it's not even all that amazing of a final boss. I mean, it's not bad, but it's not worth the headache to get to it. But anyway, if you don't want to use a completed save file to skip 1 or 2 of the teams, and you're adamant about playing through this game the way it's intended, I recommend you start with Team Sonic. Team Sonic stages are difficult, but they're also beatable. By the end of the Sonic playthrough, you'll feel like you mastered a lot of the controls and start to get a proper feel for what the game requires in different moments. After that, I would say it's best to do Team Rose's playthrough. You're probably going to feel burnout from Team Sonic's, and it'll be nice to go through the game after you've already mastered the controls. Team Rose's playthrough will be the favorite part for a lot of people because it removes a lot of the risky maneuvers that exist in Team Sonic's, and shortens the levels quite a bit. Some level maps might even be a third of the length. But it's not only about the length of the level, it's what you're required to do. In Sonic's playthrough, you might get to a certain area that requires you to defeat 3 robots that require a specific move to defeat followed by rail grinding over a bottomless pit. Whereas that same area in Amy's playthrough might just have an Eggman robot and a spring that flings you across the map into the next section. I personally think Team Rose's playthrough is too easy in that regard. But I can see the appeal of it if you're 2 or 3 levels into Team Sonic's and just not having it anymore. Since Team Rose's playthrough is so easy, I always think it should be used as the opportunity to collect the Chaos Emeralds. As you play through the game, you'll notice keys and cages that you can use your power character to break to grab a key. If you grab the key and make it to the end of the stage without getting hit a single time, you get to a bonus stage. There are multiple keys in each stage, I think 2, so if you lose the first one, you still have a chance to get the second one. In every even number stage, the bonus stage gives you a chance to get a Chaos Emerald. In the odd number stages, it's just a points thing and can get you 1-ups, which I guess is also useful. Due to how difficult it is to go through some of these stages with these keys though, I think your best bet is to collect the Chaos Emeralds with Amy's playthrough. Because, oh yeah, you need 7 Chaos Emeralds to unlock the final boss too. Luckily, you don't have to collect all 7 of them 4 times, nor do you have to collect them all with the same team. But since Team Rose's stages are shorter and more forgiving, it's the best opportunity to get the keys and make it to the end of the level. As far as the actual special stages go, well, they suck. You can sort of cheese it by using the power character and mashing the boost button, a trick that I saw on Reddit, but even then, it's not guaranteed you'll get the emerald. I don't really have anything to add about these special stages. This is one of those things where I just recommend you find a guide or some advice online and keep trying until you accomplish them. Or just use a completed save file to skip them. Anyway, even with the attempt at grabbing the keys, Team Rose's playthrough would be pretty relaxing and dare I say fun. You won't feel as frustrated, it won't take that long, and you'll probably have learned so much more by now about how each character attacks and feel like you've gotten much better at the controls. At which point, I'd recommend you jump into Team Chaotix's game mode since you have mastery over the controls now. Team Chaotix's mission structure might feel intimidating at first, but I swear it was almost as easy as Team Rose's. There are very few moments in missions that really frustrated me. Almost everything you're looking for is along your path, and for the most part, you won't have to teleport back to the early part of the stage to get something you missed, whether that's a MacGuffin to collect or an enemy to defeat. I know these Explorer missions aren't for everyone, and specifically every Sonic fan, but I think even the biggest complainer could enjoy some of these stages without using a guide. By the time you beat Team Chaotix, you'll probably feel like you can burn through Team Dark. At least, I did. I felt like it was going to be a piece of cake. I was so wrong though. The same way the drop in difficulty from Team Sonic to Team Rose was way too much, the increase in difficulty back to Team Dark was also too much. If there's one thing I can credit Team Dark playthrough for is if you're passionate about this game, I think it'd be by far the best mission to return to on a repeat playthrough because there are many, and I mean many, high risk and high reward set pieces. It's not just challenging, it's challenging and rewards you with quicker paths if you master the controls of this game. I hadn't even mastered the controls, but with all the effort I put in, I felt like I was having a lot more fun than I'd expected. But it's hard, very hard. I can't imagine how terrible it must have felt to go straight from Team Sonic to Team Dark without taking a detour through Rose and Chaotix, because that would be a linearly increasing punishment with every stage for 2 whole playthroughs. With my experience through the 4 runs, I've determined that in hindsight that this game should have been 3 teams tops. Sonic Team's playthrough should have been somewhat of a combination of the stage lengths of Team Rose's with the difficulty level of Team Sonic. That way you get a standard adventure that has stages that don't drag on too long and are not too easy to boot. So it'd be a good first playthrough of the game. After you beat Team Sonic, you should move on to Team Chaotix. Team Chaotix's playthrough should remain the same. I think it offers enough variety in the game that even though it's a second playthrough entirely, it's arguably different enough with the mission structure that it would be a different experience. At that point, beating Team Chaotix should unlock the final story, and beating the final story should beat the game. That's it. Team Dark should be post-game content for those who want to master the title and run through it on a harder difficulty, and Team Rose shouldn't exist. That's how I'd lay out the game, at least the structure of the game. You could maybe tweak it so that you can choose whichever team you want. I don't really care too much about that. I'm specifically talking about the structure of how the game is laid out, so you could keep Team Rose and have them playing Chaotix stages for all I care. Or make it so that Team Dark can be used instead of Team Sonic if that's what you prefer. The important thing is, this way you get a normal playthrough, and a mission playthrough, a final story, and reasonable post-game content playthrough. Make sense? Let's go through the story.
Okay, no more playing around!
I'm going to quickly touch up on the story because it's basically non-existent and I don't want to waste a whole section on it. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles receive a letter from Dr. Eggman, telling them in 3 days he will launch the Egg Fleet in an attempt to take over the world, challenging them to stop him. Rouge infiltrates one of Eggman's bases where she is surprised to discover Shadow, last seen falling from the space colony Ark, asleep in a pod. When she awakens him from his stasis and finds one of Eggman's robots, E-123 Omega. The three reluctantly agree to work together, with Omega wanting revenge for being locked up and Shadow, who has amnesia, wanting answers regarding who he is. Amy helps Big and Cream track down Big's pet, Froggy, and Cheese's brother, Chocola Chow, who have both gone missing. The Chaotix Detective Agency, Vector, Espio, and Charmy, receive a job offer from a mysterious client where they have to execute a series of tasks to prove himself. The four teams chase down Eggman through various zones, crossing paths with each other at several points, until they all end up on the Egg Fleet. Meanwhile, Rouge discovers an armada of Shadow androids, wondering if their Shadow is just one of them too. The Chaotix end up rescuing their mystery client, who just so happens to be Eggman. He reveals that he was locked up and betrayed by Metal Sonic, now going by Neo Metal Sonic, who has adopted the guise of Eggman and taken control of the Egg Fleet to prove himself superior to Sonic. Using the data he collected from observing the teams in actions, he transforms into the ultimate state, the Metal Overlord. Using the power of the Chaos Emeralds all the teams had collected, they work together to take down Metal, with Sonic turning Super, accompanied by Tails and Knuckles, to defeat him. After Metal Sonic is defeated and reverts back to his original form, Sonic and everyone go their separate ways, while the Chaotix chase after Eggman demanding payment from him. It's honestly that simple. I ripped the plot straight off of Wikipedia because what I originally wrote was like 3 sentences long and I didn't want to artificially extend this video for a nothing story that isn't worth neither my time nor yours. The biggest takeaway is that Shadow is still alive and the game ends with us wondering if he's the original or not, which takes us into Shadow's game. And it's hardly a cliffhanger, because he's obviously the original. The cliffhanger is more about how he survived and why there are a bunch of androids that look like him and why he's in Eggman's custody. The only thing I'll praise about the story is I enjoy the interactions between the characters. I like that it seems like Sonic Team is on an adventure together, kicking it back on another journey to find Eggman. Team Dark is learning to get along and develop their bond, and I actually appreciate that Rouge didn't go and tell Shadow what happened before because she's probably wondering what the heck is going on and doesn't want to potentially trigger anything in Shadow. Sonic Team discusses Shadow being alive too, albeit briefly, and Amy is uncomfortably obsessed with Sonic, while Team Chaotix is basically the comic relief, making their first appearance in a 3D game. Like I said, this game would fit in perfectly with the meta era. Actually, it probably would still be too deep of a story for the meta era.
Bring it on!
Alright, a Sonic game where I can actually talk about the stages without discussing the plot points in between each stage? I don't think I've done this since Sonic Generations. The game has 14 stages. Similar to the classics, it's actually 7 zones with 2 acts each, since each set of 2 stages have the same themes. They just didn't refer to them as separate acts and rather decided to give each stage their own name, which is a confusing decision because I think that's something the classic fans would have appreciated, but it's not a big deal. Anyway, something I actually really appreciate about this game is the 7 different zones offer a ton of variety in their designs. The level themes don't get too repetitive. It's easy to spot which zone you're in by looking at a screenshot since the stage offers a lot of variety. Again, in that regard, it's very similar to the classics, and there's a lot of inspiration taken from both the classics as well as the adventure games. The 7 themes are an outdoorsy sunny green area, a city, a casino, a canyon, a forest, a spooky or haunted theme, and a Sky Armada theme. Although the themes within the zones are pretty unique, when you're actually in the stages themselves, you'll notice a lot of repeated set pieces and challenges. Actually, you might notice that across different zones as well. This is largely because the devs actually did reuse a lot of assets within the same stages. It's more prevalent during the Team Dark stages because they're a bit longer, which means there's more repeated challenges, but I'd argue that the main reason it's so blatant and obvious is because you play through the game 4 times, so while each stage should have been a one and done, the fact that you'll be returning to each one 3 more times, albeit with slight adjustments in the layout and durations, really highlights those reused assets and challenges. Seaside Hill. An illustrious outdoor level with blue skies over an ocean, or sea I guess. The sun's shining and the grass is green and you notice checkered patterns all along the landscape. This stage is basically what would happen if you took Emerald Coast and Green Hill and combined them, merging the classics and the adventure games in that regard. It basically serves as a tutorial since it's the first stage most people will play, because, well, they put the actual tutorial in the wrong place, at the start of Team Rose's playthrough. I don't have a ton of things to discuss. They introduce all different types of enemies, different mechanics like the cannons and bobsled vehicle sections. It gives you a feel for how the gameplay will go, and throws around some killer whales to appeal to the adventurites. In Team Dark's playthrough, they start a bit further back in the stage. In Team Rose's playthrough, they start further into the stage and earlier than the other 2 playthroughs. And obviously, in Team Dark and Team Rose's stages, the set piece and enemy placement challenges are more difficult and easier respectively. The Team Chaotix run also has different start and end points, and in general their set pieces are more similar to Team Sonic's throughout the game, with the removal of certain things like the bobsled and the addition of warp flowers in portions of the stage that are meant to take you back in case you missed a collectible. In the case of Seaside Hill, the collectibles are hermit crabs, where I would say they are pretty easy to find as long as you proceed through the stage with caution. The next stage is Ocean Palace, basically the second act in this zone. It steps away from the coast and takes place throughout the ancient temples in the area. But it is a direct continuation of the previous stage, and introduces mechanics involving breaking down walls to advance with the power characters and hovering over giant fans in the formation, which will be done quite a bit in this game. So I don't repeat myself regarding the difficulty and layouts of the different playthroughs. I'm mostly only discussing the missions going forward unless there's a set piece I feel the need to mention. Just assume that Amy has easier badnik layouts and set piece challenges, Team Dark has more badniks and set piece challenges and arguably more locations that you can perform a risky move to go faster, and Team Sonic and Team Chaotix basically share the same difficulty. In Ocean Palace, Team Dark has the same start and end point as Team Sonic, Team Rose starts earlier and ends earlier, and Team Chaotix has a similar layout to Amy's, and the mission is to just destroy the cage containing a Chow at the end of the run. So it's not really any different in that regard than a linear stage, which I find to be kind of pointless, because if you're going to make me run through the game a 4th time with a mission structure, I should at least have some kind of motivation to explore the stage to justify this 4th playthrough. After Ocean Palace, you get your first boss battle, but I think I'm better off saving those boss battles for a discussion later. Stage 3 is Grand Metropolis, a fast-paced, high-tech city level that takes place in the sky near the top of the buildings of this industrial landscape. You run through a path consisting of blue energy, and at different points you might have to activate a switch or solve a small puzzle or defeat some badniks to turn the energy on to continue along. As far as the different playthroughs are concerned, the biggest talking points is that Team Chaotix mission involves defeating a whopping whole 85 badniks to complete the mission. That might sound intimidating, because it is, but as you run through the linear stage, I think you'll be able to hit most of them if you take it slow and do your due diligence. I was able to beat the stage without using the warp flower. Stage 4 is the next act of the industrial theme, called Power Plant. The stage is similar, but there are a lot more stopping points that involve you defeating badniks in a room to allow you to move to the next portion of the stage upwards. You're not outside as often in this stage. There's also a portion of the level that involves an elevator that slowly ascends. This is a good example of a part of the stage that respects you more with Team Dark, since in their playthrough, there will be boosts that can send you upwards and allow you to skip a slow elevator section if you're able to avoid the oncoming fire from the badniks. It rewards skilled players and punishes them if they fall. Speaking of risk and reward, there are moments throughout this game, and they occur quite a bit in this stage, where there are 2 routes that you can take. If you can complete the top challenge, whether it's homing attacks, a string of enemies, or triangle jumping, or succeeding in a Tails platforming challenge, you'll get to move forward quickly. Should you fail, however, you're dropped below and have to go through a string of tedious combat challenges against badniks to advance. In my opinion, this is peak classic Sonic design, implemented in the 3D space. There will be a few moments like this. You won't get it in every part of every level because at this point you'd effectively be designing more than one stage. But something I really appreciate that I think many others don't, is later on in the game you might face those same challenges but not have the crutch of the lower path to save you if you fall. The game is training you in the earlier stages to succeed in the later stages, which I can totally respect. But it's also why this game is considered super hard in the later stages, because fast-paced platforming and bottomless pits is a terrifying combination. Anyway, the Team Chaotix mission in this stage involves finding and destroying 3 golden turtle robots, which should be easy enough to accomplish along your path. Once again, I think this is a bit of a lame mission, and doesn't justify the 4th playthrough. So at the moment, we're at a 2-2 tie for justifiable missions in Team Chaotix. Moving on, we have Casino Park, infamous for the pinball mechanics. The bad pinball mechanics, I might add. I think this stage almost always gets discussed when people bring up Sonic Heroes, so I don't really have too much to add to that discussion. The play control is woeful during the pinball sections, and it isn't enjoyable. The best thing you could do in these stages is try and hope you get through them pinball sections as fast as possible. I say hope because I swear it's mostly up to luck. There are even moments where you're doing the whole pinball thing and you don't even realize that in order to advance you're supposed to lose at the pinball portion to continue going forwards. This level is playing a sick joke on the player, and I'm not sure if that's intentional or not, but many people did not find it funny. The first time you play these stages is always the worst, but the more you go through the pinball stuff the easier it gets. It never gets to a point where it feels good though, which is a shame. That being said, many people tend to criticize the Team Chaotix mission of this stage because you have to collect 200 rings, and that largely requires you to use the slots on the pinball tables. I don't really recall it feeling like it was a breeze, but I also wouldn't really label it as terrible like many others do. I think some people shrug it off because it takes place in the pinball stage rather than for the actual mission challenge itself. Also, using Team Blast with Team Chaotix tends to give you a ton of rings when there are badniks around, so if you keep that in mind you'll probably get through the mission much easier. Act 2 of this zone is Bingo Highway, a much more difficult version of the previous stage. Where Casino Park contained pinball sections that would frustrate you due to their control, Bingo Highway contains the high-speed slide sections with those same pinball physics and multiple pitfalls. There's also a bingo minigame here, which, like the slots in Casino Park, isn't really a requirement to advance through the stages. The Team Chaotix mission here is actually bad though. There are 20 casino chips spread throughout the stage, and you're meant to collect 10 of them. The problem is many of them are along the path of the high-speed slides, which means you're not only tested on surviving the board, you're also trying to collect the chips as you slide. It's a recipe for disaster. If there's any defense I could make, for the sake of making that defense, it's that this mission is at the very least justified because it offers a challenge that doesn't involve just getting through the level like some previous missions. And the game gives you twice the amount of chips than what's needed to collect, so there's quite a bit of buffer if you miss a chip. And my third defense is, just in my experience, that although I didn't like what is required from you from the mission, I also didn't find myself super frustrated and repeating it a ton of times and was able to get through it decently enough. Your mileage may vary, however. Next, we have Rail Canyon, the 7th stage in this game, and a tribute to Rail Canyon from SA2. And I think this is the first time in all of these Sonic games that I'll have an actual discussion on rail grinding. From Shadow's game onwards, rail grinding has more or less remained the same. Once you get on the rail, you don't really have to do anything too taxing. It isn't always flawless, but it usually is pretty easy to switch between the rails, and as the games go on, it ends up being either a spectacle moment or a quick-time event. In many cases, a homing attack puts you right on the rails too. This means that in most games in the series, the challenge isn't really the rail grinding itself, but it's how you can maneuver on and off the rails or bounce between the rails to collect something or make a jump. I'll cover the rail grinding in SA2 more in depth in the next video, but in SA2 and Heroes, there was a lot more emphasis on rail grinding with entire stages built around them. In Heroes, you can pick up a quick burst of speed by spamming an action button, but at the end of the rails, you quickly have to time a jump and make it to another rail. There's still usual switching between rails QTEs of the later games, but it's a lot more finicky and risky. The rail stages in Heroes and SA2 are often pointed at as the worst parts of the game, but interestingly enough, they're also seen as some of the best stages in the games by the fans that fully completed these titles. It's not intuitive by any means, but there's little more exhilarating in the series than being able to master jumping off a rail and landing on another one to optimize your speed or get a 1-up or whatever. In these earlier titles, the rails don't snap you onto place and pull you towards them, so there's quite a bit of learning curve involved. But when you learn it, it makes for some of the most exciting gameplay in the series, rather than a high-speed QTE spectacle as in later games. In SA2, if you slow down on the rail enough, you couldn't really regain speed without trying to pull off a jump and hoping to land back on the rail to gain speed, which made it even more difficult because that game involved using your balance during the turns. So in Heroes, they figured they'd remove the balance aspect and allow you to press a button to regain speed, and it would make it a lot easier, but still require you to master jumping between rails. And I'm not going to pretend I didn't die a ton of times trying to quickly snap between rails, but I'm also not going to pretend I didn't eventually master the rail grinding throughout this game and figure out how to quickly skip large portions of the stages by taking a leap of faith and landing on the thin rail down below. Something I couldn't really do in any of the games that followed. Oh, also, you can pick up speed by holding down the crouch button instead of mashing in Sonic Heroes. But I literally didn't figure it out until the last stage of my Team Sonic playthrough, but I'll get to that. But anyway, there's not much to add to this stage except that it's a rail stage with a lot of typical challenges on varying platform sections along the way to slow things down every now and then with minor puzzle elements. The Team Chaotix mission is to infiltrate the base, which basically means there is no mission. So that's the third mission that isn't justified for another playthrough. Next, we have Bullet Station, which starts off with similar rail challenges, but isn't a full rail level this time. There are moments where you have to jump between high-speed trains and defeat enemies and blow up the area, and a gimmick that involves firing you out of cannon where you move left or right. The Chaotix mission requires you to destroy 30 capsules, which I think is a reasonable enough mission as you progress through the stage. The ninth stage is Frog Forest, a much more calming stage than the previous two. This stage is filled with giant magical frogs that can cause it to rain. The rain then alters the level by creating platforms or trees or shrubs that allow the player to advance. This stage is unique in that not only does the placement of the frogs vary, the frogs also create different paths for the players to take. So while the general flow of the level will be similar, there's a lot more variance in these stages than meets the eye. And to top it off, the Team Chaotix mission is one that actually requires a bit of stealth, because as you advance through the stage, you need to carefully sneak by some of the frogs to advance. If you're spotted by a frog, you fail the mission. The second act is Lost Jungle, which takes place in the lower parts of the forest, just above the swamp. Rather than having the green frogs that give life to the plants, this stage contains the black frogs that actually destroy the plants in order for you to advance. The Team Sonic and Team Dark playthroughs also end the stage with a giant alligator chase that requires you to time your jumps across swinging vines to avoid getting eaten. The momentum on these things is kinda weird because you need to hit the jump button at the peak of the swing where you'd think it should be earlier, but once you learn when to press the jump button, it becomes a fun quick little challenge that should be easy to accomplish with a fun spectacle. Also, the Team Chaotix mission involves finding 10 lost chows spread throughout the map, so you're encouraged to explore as you go through. The penultimate zone is a haunted zone, with the first act being Hang Castle. This one is tough, especially the first time you run through it. Even the Team Rose playthrough might give you a challenge because there's a bit of a puzzle aspect. I think this stage took the most time in my roughly 2 hours playtime of Team Rose, which, as a reference point, Team Sonic and Team Dark took me about 4 or 5 hours each. Team Chaotix was closer to 3 hours, and Team Rose was closer to 2 hours, maybe 2.5 hours if you include the emeralds. I think if I redid Team Sonic now, it would take me an hour or so less, because there's probably a decent hour of gameplay in there as part of the learning curve or adjustment of the controls and themes of this game. Anyway, Hang Castle sorta reminds you of the ghost houses in Super Mario World, because advancing through the stage has a lot of puzzle aspects that you wouldn't really see in some of the other stages. Whether it's activating a switch to flip the level upside down, or jumping and marching over an invisible platform. There's just a lot of figuring out where to go and making sure you defeat everyone along your path to advance. Due to the nature of this level layout, it makes Team Chaotix's mission of finding 10 keys to get to the castle a bit of a chore. There are only 10 keys throughout the stage too, and while many of them are directly on your path, you do need to do a bit of searching in a stage that already requires you to do quite a bit of searching. The next act and 12th stage in the game is Mystic Mansion, and takes everything about the previous stage and ramps it up. More bottomless pits, more puzzles, more combat to advance, and by far the worst part is the ending that requires you to take 3 different bridges and defeat 3 different challenges. This was by far the most difficult when I did the Team Sonic run because it was my first time trying it, but I swear the actual layout of it is harder than Team Sonic's. There's also a part where you have to use some switches to alter a statue's formation to figure out how to get across, and eventually you get some rail grinding sections that require you to triangle jump and then land on the rail that I think some people have issues with, but honestly I didn't really have issues with either of those. I just remembered that way back when I played this game with touchscreen controls, that the triangle jump leading to a rail grind killed me a ton of times, but with a controller, I didn't find it difficult. The Team Chaotix mission requires you to blow out 60 torches. This one is a pain in the butt. Easily my least favorite Team Chaotix mission. I could forgive the puzzle aspects because it was only 10 keys, and many of them were along your route, but in this stage, they really put you to the exploration test, and there are so many torches to find. The only defense I can make is that many of the torches are in clusters of 4 or more, so that drastically shrinks down how many you actually have to find. And finally, we've made it to Eggman's Armada. Stage 13 is called Egg Fleet. You're in the sky here jumping between Eggman's ships and really feeling like this is the ending of the game. The scope and scale of this armada is kind of incredible, especially when you consider that there's no life on it. This is all created by one evil genius. He might have created the robots that are creating a lot of this, but it still goes back to him. But I'm getting a bit too existential, so I'll peel that back a bit. The stage pretty much has everything. Tons of combat, grind rails between fleets, multiple paths everywhere, giant fans, switches, triangle jumps, complex badnecks, all of it. This stage, and the next one for that matter, are very much the ultimate tests, and I am all for it. Team Chaotix has a stealth mission here too, which works well due to the layout of the stage. Once you accomplish that, the sun sets, and you're now in the final fortress. Can you say climax? Man, this stage really makes you earn the end of the game. It's very difficult. More rail grinding, harder badniks, puzzle areas to advance, routes that have upper and lower levels, but if you fail on the upper level and land on the lower level, you're still drastically tested to figure out how to get through. There are moments in this stage in particular where you have to jump off a grind rail and perform a tornado to advance onto a section where you have to land on another grind rail. This is a prime example of how each playthrough varies because depending on the playthrough, you might have to maneuver to land on one of 3 grind rails and hope you don't miss. Or in the easy version, you can bypass most of the challenges by just homing attacking onto a spring. Once again, I think the way they implemented the different challenges in this game was actually brilliantly done, and really makes me think of some of the expert and hard modes in later games that I haven't played yet that would be worth revisiting. I'm assuming they didn't make those modes required in later games because of the backlash this game received. The very last challenge of this stage is when I learned that if you hold the crouch button you go faster on rail grinding, and it was only after dying a bunch of times while mashing the button and getting a game over as a result. It was legitimately frustrating, but I had no problems at that portion with the later playthroughs because I already learned what I had to do, even if the challenge shifted. And once again, the final mission for Team Chaotix is to find 10 keys to enter. I think it's fair to point out that strictly from the perspective of what each mission is, and ignoring the difficulty aspect of the missions, Team Chaotix playthrough is mostly justified save 3 levels, and only super duper frustrating in maybe 2 or 3 of them. Like I said earlier in this video, I think the Chaotix missions are completely acceptable requirements in this game to complete it, but I don't think I can justify having to play the regular modes 3 times. I can't even justify the fact that you'd have to do it twice, nor can I justify the collection of the emeralds. I'll reiterate that the ideal structure of this game would have been some kind of combination of Team Sonic's difficulty with Team Rose's layout. I think the Team Sonic stages offer a good challenge, but they're just too long. And when you beat that story, you unlock Team Chaotix's missions and have to beat those. And with the completion of that, you should be able to unlock the final story. Team Dark should be included with the post-game content, and I know there's already post-game content, but I'm not getting into that. I can forgive Team Rose being included in this theoretical game if it had a giant easy mode caption written by it and didn't unlock anything else. That way, you don't exclude anyone that isn't able to accomplish Team Sonic stages. And I think as a bonus, rather than tying the stage types to the teams, you should be able to play any stage layout you want with any team just to put some choice in the player's hands rather than tie the characters to the difficulty. Anyway, I just wanted to quickly point out, or reiterate rather, that I like the level selection in this game. I enjoy the themes and challenges it provides. There isn't too much I would change about the stages offered themselves from a design standpoint. My only gripes would be the difficulty that I discussed at the opening of this game in regards to bottomless pits and adjusting to the controls, but I think that's more of a mechanical issue than anything else. But finally, let's discuss the bosses and wrap this retrospective up. Following the footsteps of the classics, after every second act there's a boss battle you have to face in order to get to the next zone. For a variety of reasons, each one has its shortcomings, and the one that offers the best challenge has the worst premise. And really, I'm being generous here by implying there are 7 boss battles, because the reality is there's only 3 boss battles, each repeated twice, and the final one being against the Egg Emperor. The Egg Hawk and Egg Albatross are basically the same fight, and they occur after the 2nd and 8th stage. I'm sure there are more optimal ways to beat them, but you can choose these battles by finding a way to homing attack over and over again. You might have to weasel your way around the physics and mechanics a bit, but for the most part, I beat these guys by just repeating homing attacks. After the 4th and 10th stage, you face a team battle. There's nothing really to say here except just keep spamming the tornado attack over and over again until you win. Sometimes it's quick, sometimes you have to spam it more, but yeah, that's it. After the 6th and 12th stages, you probably have the least inventive boss battle, but the ones that offer the best challenge, albeit frustrating challenge. Robot Carnival and Robot Storm are essentially just battles against waves of Eggman's robots over and over again. If you're not used to what every Badnik's weakness is, whether it's getting stunned from the flying character, or getting flipped or removing a shield or helmet by a tornado and whatnot, you're going to learn it during these fights. Furthermore, if you're not used to how slippery and finicky certain aspects of the controls are, you're going to learn that during these fights. You have to. Because if you still can't figure out the timing of homing attacks, or how to comfortably use Knuckles near the edge of a stage without falling off, or even how to power up different formations by collecting orbs, and figuring out when it's optimal to use Team Blasts, you're going to fail. You need to learn all of these things to advance. And while it's obnoxiously frustrating and annoying to get through, the lessons you learn during each one of these battles will ultimately help you get through the rest of the game. It not only serves as a boss battle, but it serves as sort of a standardized litmus test to ensure you, the player, will be able to make it through the end of the game. But I promise you, especially during Team Sonic's playthrough, these boss fights are going to put you through the ringer. But when you repeat the fights with the other teams, it'll be a lot easier because you'll have learned how to confront them by now, even with the difficulty spike in Team Dark. And just as a fun little side note, this is where my playthrough with the touch controls ended the first time I played this game. It was when I fought Robot Storm after Mystic Mansion, because I could not for the life of me beat this without a controller, so I'm pretty sure back then I just took the L and watched a playthrough for Egg Fleet and Final Fortress and called it a day. But this time, I played it and beat it and made it all the way to Egg Emperor. I struggled a lot with Egg Emperor and Team Sonic's playthrough, but eventually I figured out that if you use Tails and power him up, it's the optimal way to succeed. His attacks also fill up the Team Blast meter the quickest. Once I figured out the flying formation was optimal, it made the boss fight significantly easier and quite frankly as disappointingly simple as Hawk, Albatross, and the team battles in this game. So all in all, I think it's fair to say the boss fights in this game kinda stink. Or at the very least, they're easily cheesable. I could chalk it down to me knowing how to choose the fights going into them as being the reason why they stink, but I argue that a good boss fight shouldn't be able to be cheesed. It should offer a challenge even if you know how to beat it. Figuring out how to cheese a fight shouldn't be the actual challenge. But quite frankly, given how the rest of the game is played, I'm okay with the boss battles being easier because the 2 gauntlet fights in most of the stages already provided enough of a challenge in this game. Then you also have the final story face-off against Metal Sonic that has 2 phases. The first phase feels more like a puzzle or a stage than an actual fight, but I enjoyed it regardless, even if it's a bit repetitive. With Team Rose, you can quickly defeat Metal by performing Team Blast with the boxes provided. With the remaining teams, you just need to keep striking at Metal's weak points with the characters opposite of the color the weak point exposes. There's also a cannon you can use to hammer down Metal's health, and there's a bit of challenge involved in dodging Metal's attacks. I died a few times with Team Chaotix's portion. Team Dark was naturally the most difficult to juggle dodging attacks and performing attacks at Metal, but again you just need to keep chipping away, ideally with Rouge until you defeat him. And with all of that done, I mean, honestly, it's more spectacle than anything else. Just keep firing away at Metal until you get Team Blast a few times and he's defeated. But I'm always a sucker for these supersonic kaiju fight endings, so I can't really complain. I think the conclusion to this game is easy, but it's a fun and lighthearted end to a game that masks itself as a lighthearted adventure but really puts you through the test to succeed. There's a big gripe that I personally have with this game that it might not apply to everyone though, and it's that despite the fact that I think the gameplay is totally acceptable, I can't call this one of the best Sonic games due to the lack of a story. I don't like that the community has shrugged off stories of these games into nothingness. From a gameplay perspective, I think it could stand the ground with the best of them. It could definitely use some tweaks, but I think Heroes and even Shadow should in theory be loved by anyone that enjoys the boost games. As long as you can adjust the controls, and I know that's a big ask for so many super sensitive Sonic fans that need their backs massaged so they don't get a cramp while sitting on their chair in order to play the game the way they think it should be done. Sorry, I don't know where that came from. But like I was saying, if you can adjust to the controls and you don't like the adventure style levels and prefer the speed stages of Sonic games, I think it's worth getting used to the projectiles in Shadow, the team mechanics in Heroes, and the control in both in order to enjoy the games. These are very easy to play on Dolphin, even in widescreen, and I would recommend any Sonic fan that doesn't like trying anything but typical linear level design to give them a shot if they already haven't. You don't even need to fully complete the game, or do the missions if you don't want to. Just get completed save files for Shadow and play through the expert mode, and play through only Team Sonic's playthrough in Heroes. And if you decide you want more, do more. I think there are a plethora of reasons why this game was largely considered as the start of the Dark Ages for so many older Sonic fans. The lack of a story for some, the complex team mechanics for others, the performance issues primarily for the majority of PS2 owners, the difficult nature of the game that frustrated so many people that rather than getting better at the game, they chalked it down to being a bad game. But I think the fact that in such a short amount of time the community came in and switched around the opinion of Heroes is a testament as to why it shouldn't be classified as part of the Dark Age. I liked Shadow in 06, but I understand their shortcomings. Well, more so I understand 06's shortcomings. But at least for Shadow's game, I understand why the community was being all melodramatic about it. But Heroes is not a Dark Age game. It's one of the better Sonic games in my opinion. I'll have to do a tier list at some point, but that'll be for later. For now, I just want to say that I've had such a blast going through this series, and I cannot wait to play Sonic Adventure 2 again, and see if my perspective of it being my favorite Sonic game will change because of this retrospective experience I've gone through. We'll see you next time. As always, thanks for... Wait, I forgot to say I love the music and the main theme of Sonic Heroes!